Okay, you guys, camera management is always going to be the issue, so I keep running out of either the data card or the battery, and sometimes both of them happening together, so it just takes me a few hours later and I come back and I'm going to finish this. And I can't tell you how happy I am to get to do this, because when I'm not doing this, my wife is making me do all kinds of work. I get up in the morning, I've got to unload the dishwasher, I've got to cook the breakfast, I've got to cook the lunch,
Chris, are you talking about me to your students again?
No, honey, just saying good things, and thanks for all the help that you've been giving me.
Well, all right, but get done quick because I have some more chores for you.
Okay.
Don't believe a word he says.
Anyway, just kidding. Patty's been very helpful. She's writing out all these things, of course. Even had her write my little goofs papers. Okay, so I need to finish up with World War I. I told you that by October of 1918, the Germans are reeling. The fronts are, well, not, the Western Front is collapsing upon them. The home front, the people are starving to death, basically. And the German High Command, in a way that really was at least benign to their own people, kind of realized that the writing was on the wall, that Germany is going to be defeated relatively quickly. And at that moment, there had been no advances of the Allies into German territory. So the Germans are actually still occupying parts of France and Belgium, and not to mention occupying huge chunks to the east into Russia. So the German High Command, attentive to what it was that Wilson had said. Wilson had said, let's have peace without victory, an end to the war without winners and without losers. And of course, if you're beginning to lose, that's going to sound pretty good. So the Germans approach the Americans as best they possibly can through a variety of channels to begin to try to get this arrangement to come. And of course, Wilson was more than happy to accommodate them. He wanted there to be an end to this war. Now, the Americans were willing to allow the Germans to move towards the ending of the war, but only if the Germans would do some very important kind of things. So the Germans, basically an ultimatum on the part of the United States, that the Germans must end their empire, of course, and create a republican form of government. They must force the Kaiser to abdicate. I have to tell you, it won't be too many more days before the Kaiser will actually abdicate. And indeed, that Germany will have to evacuate all occupied territories. And the Germans really realizing that the alternative was, fairly fundamental defeat in this situation, agreed to this. The Germans and the Americans come to agreement, at least in principle, about the ending of the war. The problem wasn't so much between the Americans and the Germans, but rather between the Americans and the Allies, the other Allies. Britain and France, they couldn't abide this notion of peace without victory. I mean, they had to win this war, basically. And Wilson, he had to promise them at least something, but also threaten them. If you don't go along with the ending of the war in this particular way, then then the United States will back out. And can you imagine the Americans leaving the war at this critical moment? Of course, it would just put everything into chaos, essentially. Anyway, ultimately there is an agreement to end the war and to create what they call an armistice. And that armistice will come on, of course, a very interesting moment. It will be proclaimed for the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It wouldn't have been so cool if it was the 11th year of the 11th century. But of course, this is 11 o'clock in the morning of November the 11th, 1918. And this is the day that the armistice will occur. Now, one thing that is just totally disheartening for me to have to tell you is that in the approach to the armistice, they negotiated the end of the war at one particular moment. I don't know about you, but if you get within a week of ending a war, it seems like a good idea just to stop fighting. But that's not the way it happened at all. Indeed, significant amounts of activity were occurring up until the very last moment, essentially. My grandfather was actually at the front at that time. And this is my grandfather on my mother's side, and he wrote a number of letters back home to his parents and to his brothers and sisters. And, he described that last day, he was part of in the artillery. And basically for 48 hours, they put everything in their guns that they could and just fired fired them off at the Germans, essentially. So, instead of everyone saying, okay, we're over and it's done, they continued to wage war to the last second. And I was just intrigued. I had never looked for this, but I wanted to know, how many people died. And I only found statistics for that last day, so November 11th. And this is only between, the beginning of the day and 11 o'clock in the morning. but there were over 11,000 casualties in that day, including 3,000 Americans. And I came across the name of the last American to be killed. His name was Private Henry Gunter, and he was killed at 10:59, 1 minute short of the armistice, essentially. But just such a stupid ending to such a terrible war, that they continued to fight to the very last moment. Later on, there would be there would be questioning of, like, General Pershing, the head of the American Expeditionary Force. Why did you fight to the last moment? He basically said that he felt that that was the right thing to do, and that they needed to convince the Germans, of course, that they would have to be part of this armistice in that way. But just that people were being killed up to the last second seems like a horrible thing. In my grandfather's letter, he describes the moment of the armistice, that 11 o'clock moment on November the 11th. And of course, they had just been this continual barrage that was taking place, and then it all stopped. And my grandfather waxed a little bit poetically right there, saying, the silence echoed in his ears or something like that. But then he notes that he heard this enormous cheer that was rising up from the trenches on both sides of the line, essentially, as all these individuals who had somehow survived this extraordinary bloodletting. And indeed, this is the day of the armistice. It would become a huge holiday across the world. They would celebrate November the 11th. It is intriguing that at some point, different nations will move away from treating it as the Armistice Day, and in many ways it's an indication of the negative outcomes associated with World War I. Today in the United States, of course, November 11th is celebrated, but not as Armistice Day, but rather as Veterans Day. We're remembering the veterans, and really we're kind of moving ourselves away from the connection of that with World War I, because such an awful outcome to such an awful war. Anyway, the armistice was signed in a train car that was located on a siding in the Ardennes forest. It was a train car of General Foch of the French. The German High Command, the Allied High Command were all there, of course. They will sit down and sign these articles of the armistice ending the war, which in many ways were fairly harsh on the Germans. The Germans were in the negative position in terms of the way the war was developing at that time. And so they signed them, and of course that is the end of the war. And what's intriguing is, and it kind of shows you the German perspective on this, I've been told that every single German who signed that armistice agreement would be assassinated within the next few years. I mean, as the Germans will see this as an extraordinary betrayal, a stab in the back, basically, and thus they will make those who participated in this pay in a major way. And one last thing about that rail car: the rail car remained there as a monument to the end of the peace. So it went from being just a rail car on a siding to be kind of a location that, if you want, like a pilgrimage site to remember the end of the war. Well, that rail car will come into play again in June of 1940, when Hitler invaded into France and forced the French to surrender relatively rapidly. He dragged their butts back to that car, and he forced them to sign the Articles of Surrender in that same car. So that car becomes really a symbol of the failure to really deal with the issues of World War I, rather than any kind of significant suggestion of peace or anything like that. But the war does finally come to an end, and there's general celebration across the entire world because of that. Bloodletting will at least have stopped. Now, what will end the war, we have a war, of course, but you have to somehow kind of codify the ending of that war, primarily through some kind of a treaty. And what will end World War I is a monumental treaty called the Peace of Paris. And this will take place in 1918. This is the final major act of World War I, the Peace of Paris. And what they will do in Paris in 1918 is they will hold this conference, massive conference. It is really the first great international conference where people from all over the world will come, just kind of in a spectacular array. I do have to tell you that the movie cameras, of course, are functional at that time. So where the main meeting hall was, some guy set up a camera and he just rolled it. It's just as the delegates are coming in, and you just see them. The car rolls up, the people get out. But the thing that's so interesting, of course, and a lot of them are just men dressed in suits, but you see Arabs coming, and Chinese people coming, and Indians coming, and people from Polynesia coming, as everyone in the world basically had something that they were trying to find in the aftermath of this war, something they were trying to gain, would come to this massive global conference, of course, which was his goal was to try to settle the issues associated with World War I. Now, Woodrow Wilson was, aware of all that's happening here. And he decided that the Peace of Paris, this ending of the war, was so critical that he needed to go himself to Paris to become a major player in terms of the peace process. Now, I have to tell you that today that would hardly be an issue at all, but at that time that was something like a constitutional controversy. No sitting president had ever left the contiguous area of North America. And I do want you to know that the president who had gotten the farthest away was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had gotten all the way down to Panama to watch over, to see the components of the building the Panama Canal. And presidents had gone to Canada and presidents had gone to Mexico and done that kind of thing. But none of them had ever left the contiguous area of North America to go to Europe. Nowadays they can go there in one day and be back and we won't even know that it's happened. But in those days that was kind of a remarkable thing. Anyway, there were those who thought this couldn't happen, but Wilson just simply said, I'm not that far away. On a fast destroyer, I could be back in 5 days. We have instantaneous telegraphic communication. So he saw it as no particular constitutional crisis and instead thought, he should go, and that's exactly what he's going to do. When Wilson arrives in Europe, it is one of the more remarkable moments in really American history, because he is met by monster crowds, huge crowds of people, and all of them basically just honoring this particular person. When he would come ashore, there'd be these big banners and signs. It would say William the Just and Wilson the Just and Wilson the God of Peace. That's one of my favorites that I saw, Wilson the God of Peace. And when he would walk around, little girls would throw rose petals in front of him where he would go. And when he finally got to Paris, 2 million people turned up to watch him, to watch the parade of him coming in. 2 million people. The population of Paris at that time was 1 million, so double the population of Paris turned out to see Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson was a little bit delusional about what was happening here. He saw them as, liking his peace plan, the 14 points, the peace without victory, all those kind of ideas. And really they were simply celebrating the fact that, the Americans had come and ended this war. And so they're going to honor Woodrow Wilson for his particular role in this. But Wilson indeed comes to Paris to be a fundamental part of this. He became part of what they called the Big Four, So these are the 4 major players. And really it's 3 and then 1 that they kind of add on. But Wilson really is the leader of the entire activity. There was George Clemenceau, the president of France. There was David Lloyd George, the prime minister of Great Britain. And then there was Orlando Vittorio, who was, I think, either the prime minister or president of Italy. And Vittorio is the least, Orlando is the least of the activists in this. And really, it's pretty much David Lloyd George, Wilson, and Clemenceau, who are the ones that are really kind of the guiding light of this. Now, the Peace of Paris is such a monumental activity that they had to subdivide it because there were so many different issues they had to confront. So they subdivided the peace into treaties. There are a lot of treaties. I should know, I don't know how many treaties there are of the Peace of Paris, but there are numerous treaties. And each treaty would be assigned to a particular issue. That issue could be the people living in the Balkan area, that could be issues of colonial issues, that could even be issues like of China and Japan. And these were assigned to their own particular kind of areas. And all these issues had to come into play. But each issue was assigned to a particular neighborhood of Paris. So, for instance, there was the Treaty of Saint-Denis. That one is a legitimate one, and I don't know the names of any others, but I'll say the Treaty of the Arc de Triomphe, the Treaty of the Eiffel Tower, the Treaty of the Louvre, whatever. There's a bunch of treaties, and all of them are assigned to particular areas and neighborhoods of Paris. But the most important treaty was assigned to the most fabulous suburb of Paris. This was a suburb that was established essentially under the reign of Louis XIV, where he built himself this magnificent palace essentially as a manifestation of his power as he centralized this power over the French state, basically. Anyway, a symbol of his power, but also a device to control the aristocracy. The most important treaty that will become part of the Peace of Paris, named after the famous palace that is located in this famous suburb. And I'm going to give you guys a chance to guess. It's called the Treaty of 1, 2, 3. Yes, indeed, it is the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is this extraordinary location, of course, and I have to tell you that I have actually gone to the Palace of Versailles. I do want you to know that I did not do myself well there. It was a super hot day. We get out there. It's relatively expensive. We couldn't find a bathroom. I mean, you got this huge place that got 14,000 rooms and you can't find a damn bathroom in the entire thing. And then I found out that you have to pay to go in the gardens extra. I was just like, I don't know, pissy that day, so it's kind of a bad thing. Next day, I promise, and next time I go, I will go in a much better mood, I can promise you that. But anyway, the most important component of the Peace of Paris is indeed the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, of course, a potential identification for our class. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles is to deal with the one fundamental issue in the aftermath of World War I, and that was to deal with Germany. It was Germany's misfortune that they were really the only existent entity that had been participated in the war. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had disintegrated, the Ottoman Empire had disintegrated. The only country that's sort of left there in any kind of way standing is Germany. And this is kind of tragic for Germany because the burden then of the war is going to fall essentially on Germany. One thing that is included in the Treaty of Versailles is this thing called the War Guilt Clause, the War Guilt Clause. So what that means is the Treaty of Versailles is going to assign guilt to blame someone for the war. Now, if you really want to blame people for the war, World War I, you have to spread it relatively widely. Fundamental are the behaviors of the Serbians and the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians. All of them are like, their activities are some of the worst. But the Germans they're part of this process. There's no doubt about that. Everyone's part of it to some degree. Even the activities of the French and the British are absolutely not above total reproach in any kind of way. But so it's a diffuse blame that has to be spread out, and most of it really should go like to Austria-Hungary and Serbia and the Russians, I would say. Germany is the only really existing entity, and so the decision is made, and you guys all know how it is. The history is written by the victors. That Germany will be to blame for this. So there was the War Guilt Clause. I wish I could remember the number for it. It's Article 271 or something like that. I can't remember. 134, one of those. Anyway, it's the War Guilt Clause, and it blames Germany for the war. And since they blame Germany, of course, that means that they can punish Germany for the war. And the Treaty of Versailles is very much, about punishing Germany for the war. So let me just tell you exactly what's happening here. They're going to do a number of things to Germany. Germany is going to lose significant territory. Part of it will be given over to Poland, part to Czechoslovakia, part of it will be returned to France. That's the Alsace-Lorraine part that I told you about. So Germany is, of course, going to lose significant part of their land. Germany will be demilitarized in every way you can think of. The German army would be reduced to 100,000 men. This is from the millions of man army that they would have had before, down to 100,000. 100,000 was the same size as the Swiss army. So that put them on the equivalent of the Swiss army. But don't denigrate the Swiss army because they got those really cool knives and they can do a lot of fancy things with them, as I'm sure that you know. Not only would they reduce the size of the military, but they also pretty much sank the navy. They took the German High Fleet off of north of Great Britain, north of Scotland, a place called Scapa Flow, and they just sank the damn thing. Which, when I think about that, I was thinking it would have been smarter to maybe recycle it, but at least it was symbolically powerful. And then they also demilitarized a part of Germany called the Rhineland. The Rhineland is the area that butts up against France, and the French did not want there to be any military facility in that particular area. It'd be the equivalent of saying that there could be no military facilities or bases all through the West Coast, Oregon, Washington, and California. So Germany was significantly demilitarized as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And then finally, Germany is basically given the bill for the war. These are called reparations, down there at the very bottom. Reparations were payments that Germany would have to make in a variety of different ways to primarily the French and the British. And I have to tell you that there was really no amount that was stated. In fact, the British and the French could put whatever they wanted into the bill, including like future pensions for their soldiers and stuff like that. They were to start paying around 1919. They were to continue paying, I think, until like 1966 or something like that. There was going to be this long period of payments in both money and in kind. There are some manifestations of the actual reparations, like coal trains leaving Germany, going to France, and just giving them that particular amount of coal. In reality, the reparations only last until 1929, when the global economy is just rendered in the face of the coming of the Great Depression. But anyway, the Germans are hit with all of this. They're demilitarized, they're losing territory, they're going to have to pay for the war in this kind of open-ended bill that could go on forever, basically. All this is going to be put upon the Germans. Now, the Germans, of course, saw this as an essential expression of betrayal. And all you're really doing here is generating tremendous animosity and a desire for revenge on the part of many Germans. In the moment of the Treaty of Versailles, of course, Adolf Hitler is gaining traction, of course. This is what will become his life quest, to do everything he can to reverse the Treaty of Versailles. Germans call it the Diktat. This is being dictated to them. And they saw it as an essential betrayal of what they thought they were getting. Thought they're getting peace without victory. And instead, they're getting a hammer job, of course, and that became part of it. Now, I do want you to know that Woodrow Wilson did not like the Treaty of Versailles at all. But here was his problem. He wanted to get his 14 points across. He wanted all that apparatus of what he hoped would create a just and lasting peace. Most importantly, of course, he wanted the Association of Nations of the League of Nations. But the only way he could get this from the Allies was to promise them that they would have a victory, that they're not going to... Basically, Lloyd George and Clemenceau told Wilson, if you don't give us a victory in this war, we will be lynched in the streets. And I think that may have been absolutely what would have happened, okay? So Wilson reluctantly consents to the punishments upon Germany. He says they'll be angry. He said they'll seek to reverse this, of course. He's absolutely correct in all of these particulars. But indeed, there was no other way that he could get his 14 points, and he did. The 14 points are pretty much ensconced within the Treaty of Versailles and the Peace of Paris. So all the things that he'd wanted would happen, especially, of course, the League of Nations. And he kind of put his faith in the League of Nations, that in the end, that international organization will be able to solve whatever issues there are moving forward. At least that's the way that he hoped it would happen, okay? All right. Now, what happens is Wilson comes home, okay, and just here's an essential reality of the American constitutional regime. While presidents can make treaties, those treaties have to be ratified, they have to be approved by the Senate. The Senate has that constitutional power to ratify and confirm all treaties. I think ratify is the correct word here, okay? Anyway, so Wilson brings the treaty, the Peace of Paris, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, all of that component, all of that apparatus back to America, and then hands it over to the Senate, assuming that the Senate is going to ratify this, okay? Long story very short, the Senate will not do that. The Senate will ultimately reject the Treaty of Versailles, the Peace of Paris, the League of Nations, okay? So that shows you kind of the direction this is all going to head. Short story long, but let me tell you exactly what happened. All of the treaty, the Peace of Paris goes to the Senate. The Senate at that time had a Republican majority. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee was headed up by Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a Republican from the state of Massachusetts. And Lodge pretty much had a personal animosity towards Wilson. And by the way, the Republicans didn't like the fact that Wilson is becoming like the god of this particular moment, of course. They didn't like the idea that he was having all of these important political victories. So the Republicans didn't out and out renounce that Treaty of Versailles and the Peace of Paris, but instead they began to pick at it, this little thing and that little thing that they didn't like. Now, Wilson's culpable in the outcome here. He basically told the Senate, I have worked my butt off to get this package, and you are going to agree to it just the way it is, of course. And that's not exactly the way you commence any kind of significant negotiation. Now, facing a situation where the Senate seemed to be resisting what Wilson wanted, Wilson decided that he was going to take it to the people. And so he took off on what we would call a whistle-stop campaign. He's going to travel all across America. And what would happen is the train would pull into the city or the town, and the crowd would gather, and Wilson would go out on the back of the train. He'd give this rousing speech about, how important the Peace of Paris, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations were, how this will create a just and lasting. He was just simply trying to generate a groundswell of popular support as far as these activities were concerned. And he went from one town to another to another. Now, what no one knew at that time was that Wilson was pretty dangerously ill. He was suffering from hypertension, and of course, I don't think they were quite as aware of exactly what... I'm sure there was just the general exhaustion of his various efforts at coming out of war, and now this campaign to try to promote this. And he made it all the way to Pueblo, Colorado, but he's giving a speech in Pueblo, and he collapses, so he's physically unable to continue. And they're worried that something really bad is happening, so they put him on an express train and they rush him back to Washington, D.C. And he gets back just in time to suffer a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He has a stroke in a very significant kind of way. And that stroke is just incredibly disabling as far as Wilson is concerned. It creates another kind of interesting constitutional situation that the president was absolutely unable to govern at that time. And it's intriguing that what happened was that they were able to keep Wilson's real condition kind of secret away from the press and away from common knowledge. So Wilson is in his bedroom being attended, of course, by doctors in the White House. And bills would come and legislation would come, of course, and his wife and Colonel House, his assistant, would take whatever that was into Woodrow Wilson, and it would come out signed in a really kind of little troubled signature, something like that. There are some people that argue that we've already had a woman president, and it was Mrs. Wilson, because Mrs. Wilson is probably signing these things for her husband, but Woodrow Wilson is disabled, Woodrow Wilson is unable, and perhaps it would have been the thing to do for him not to continue as president, for the vice president to step in, but this simply was not done at that time, and he's able to keep at least the pretense of being in command of the situation. And by the time we get to the very end of his term, he actually is well enough to be walking around, to be seen, of course. He will go to the inauguration of the next president and all those kind of things. But here's the thing. The champion of the Peace of Paris, the champion of the League of Nations, the champion of the Treaty of Versailles is unable to do that anymore. And without anyone aggressively promoting all of these things, the Senate will ultimately decide no. And almost a year to the day, I think it was like November the 16th or something like that, it was November the 18th, 1919, the Senate refuses to ratify these treaties. Okay, so what that means is the United States is not part of the Peace of Paris. It is not a signatory component of the Treaty of Versailles. It is not a member of the League of Nations. It's just kind of an amazing thing here at the United States. This was all Wilson's idea. This was all Wilson's plan. Yet the Americans, of course, are not going to be a participant in that, at least at the very beginning. Anyway, I do want you to know that this, we shouldn't just blame the Republicans in the Senate for this. The reality was that the vast majority of Americans did not like what had happened. They didn't think Americans should be that involved. They didn't think we should be part of this League of Nations, which by definition was kind of an entanglement, bringing the Americans into whatever was happening as far as the world was concerned. And so in many ways, the failure of the Peace of Paris in America, the failure of the Treaty of Versailles, the failure of the League of Nations is an indication of the constituent opinion of the people of the United States of America. So what that leaves us with, I always think, okay, so we get to 1919, what do I tell you what's happening? I'm going to call it the great step back. It's like the Americans were right there on the cusp of becoming the global superpower. I mean, they had all of the apparatus for this. They could do it at that particular second, right? And yet, because of their notions of isolationism, they didn't want to be ingrained and intermixed or involved in the situation as far as the world was concerned. And so they're taking, this fairly substantial step back into isolationism. And the intriguing thing, of course, is that it will take World War II, the lack of solution to World War I leaves the world in a situation where things are unsettled, to say the least, and indeed, the world will become drifting towards World War II. I may say this again later, but there are people who believe that in the future we'll simply call this the Great War of the 20th century. That began in 1914. There's a hiatus, and then it starts up again, and then it's finally over in 1945, when a final and a fairly substantial solution will come into play there. Anyway, I'm just going to finish this with one little anecdote for you guys. In September of 1939, they had finally constructed the building that was to house the League of Nations. It was located in Geneva, Switzerland, and was called the Hall of Justice. And they had this nice big building there. And on the day, I think it was the first day of September, they had a dedication. So they're dedicating the hall, and they were dedicating not only the building itself, but also this big plaque. And the big plaque was dedicated to the founder of the League of Nations. So it's just a big round plaque up on the wall. And it showed the profile, of course, of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was perceived, here's this American president, of course, who's perceived as being the founder of the League of Nations. And just a moment of tremendous irony, at that same moment that they are dedicating this building, of course, which was designed to solve the problems of the world, the German panzer divisions are invading into Poland in what will begin the beginning of the European phase of World War II. And of course, you don't want to blame the Americans for any of this, but it's interesting to contemplate if the Americans had stepped forward, if they had become a major player in terms of the world in the aftermath of World War I, would they have been able to resolve some of these issues or guided the world to a more peaceful outcome? I think that was the lesson that was learned, though, from that moment, that after World War II, the Americans do step forward, and of course, they assume the mantle of the leadership of the world, essentially. And we have then attained what we call sometimes the Pax Americana, the American peace, where there has not been a world war, of course, but there's been so much little other kind of wars and continue, it's hard to call it exactly the Pax. But anyway, By the time we get to 1919, of course, you know, the Americans are on the doorstep of becoming a superpower, but instead of stepping forward, they're going to step back. And what I'll do when we come back next time, of course, I'm going to embrace a new topic of the 1920s. Do know that at this moment we have finished all the materials associated with the second midterm examination. And I will release the notes. Well, I've already released the notes for the Progressive Era. I will release the notes for the Rise to World Power relatively soon. You know, I always hope that people are watching the videos to kind of, you know, connect all the dots of the notes, but to make sure that you have all the information that you need as you go forward. Make sure that if you have any questions on any of the presentation or any comments or any issues, I do feel so disconnected in some ways. Here I'm sitting up here in my bonus room, you know, talking to a stupid camera. But if there are any issues questions that you have for me, please email me or contact me in whatever you want. And anyway, I'll see you next time.